Okay, we want to evaluate cosine of pi over 2. Well, cosine corresponds to the x-coordinate of the endpoint. And the x-coordinate, if we look at it, remember, pi over 2 takes us to the vertical or the positive y-axis. So for the positive y-axis on the unit circle, that endpoint is going to be 0. So then cosine of pi over 2 equals 0. Now we want to do sine of pi over 2. Sine is the y-coordinate. And if it's the unit circle, this point up here is the point 0, 1. So that means that the y-coordinate is 1. And the sine of pi over 2 is 1. Now let's look at our negative angle. Okay, negative pi over 2. Coordinates of this point, the x is 0, the y is negative 1. So if cosine is the x-coordinate, then cosine of negative pi over 2 is 0. Sine is the y-coordinate, so sine of negative pi over 2 is negative 1. Now for pi over 4, that becomes a little different. But what happens with pi over 4, it turns out that the x and y coordinates are the same. So they're the same distance, so we can look at it as 1 squared equals x squared plus x squared. So 1 equals 2x squared. 1/2 equals x squared. Because this is a positive, then square root of 1/2 equals x. Square root of 1 over square root of 2 equals 1 over square root of 2, but we can't leave a radical in the denominator. So we multiply it by square root of 2 over square root of 2, which means the x and y coordinates both are square root of 2 over 2. So cosine of pi over 4 is square root of 2 over 2. Sine of pi over 4 is square root of 2 over 2. Now 3 pi over 4 is going to be in the second quadrant. X in the second quadrant is negative. Y is positive. So cosine of 3 pi over 4 is negative square root of 2 over 2. Suppose theta is an angle such that sine of theta is 0.6. And suppose that pi over 2 is less than theta is less than pi. We want to find the cosine of theta. Now, if it's between pi over 2 and pi, that means we're in the second quadrant where x is negative and y is positive. Now, we have an identity that tells us that sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta equals 1. Well, we have sine of theta is 0.6. So we have 0.6 squared plus cosine squared of theta equals 1. 0.6 squared is 0.36 plus cosine squared theta is 1. Subtracting 0.36, we get cosine squared theta is 0.64. Taking the square root, we would typically have the cosine theta equals plus or minus square root of 0.64, which gives us a plus or minus 0.8. But in this case, we know that x is negative, so cosine has to be negative. So cosine is a negative 0.8. Okay, we're next going to look at additional trig functions other than just sine and cosine.